Welcome to Business Dynamics. In this video series, we will go over this book, Business Dynamics, Systems Thinking and Modeling for Complex World by John Sterman. In this video, I'll cover some of the summary that I learned from chapter 1, which is all about complex systems. How do we learn of a complex system and how do we learn in a complex system? So let's get into it. So why do we study business dynamics or systems thinking? We know that in modern times right now, the only constant thing is change. Everything is changing at a much rapid pace, be it global climatic conditions, be it the pace of innovation in technology, in healthcare, medicine. Everything's changing really quickly. And for us to comprehend this change itself is a big task. And we all struggle when it comes to comprehending this big amount of change. And we don't realize that a lot of these changes that we are seeing are intended and unintended consequences of our own actions as human beings. Many times when we solve a particular environmental problem, we actually make it worse. And many times when we don't implement those policies that need to be implemented in a timely fashion, the global situation becomes worse. Similarly, if we can understand the business that we are in, the people, the complexity, the technology, then if we have a better understanding of the system, we will make better decisions. So why study system dynamics or business dynamics? If we study and get a deeper understanding of system dynamics, it will alter our decision-making process because it will give us access to new models and it will change our mental models. And when our mental model changes, then our structural decision-making process changes. And when our decision changes, new strategies and new things get implemented. So basically, it gives us a tool set of computerized simulation modeling, which augments our understanding and makes our decision-making process better. So let's get into the details of each of these things. Again, the goal of system dynamics is accelerated learning. We will, with the tools in this book, understand how to model complex systems, businesses, complex economic situations, complex policy making. And once we understand these tools, we could use this in our day-to-day life. Like when we have to understand what strategies should we implement against a competitor in our current business. How do we model the behavior of a new technology in all of that? And if we really want to implement a new strategy or implement some sort of a change in a system, then the first thing we need to do is to understand the entire system as best as possible and as accurately as possible. And system dynamics is an intersection of mathematics because it gives us access to tools of modeling using computer science, because uses technology in a pretty big way, uses human psychology for modeling behavior. It also includes organizational theory as to how people interact, how organizations change. And so let's look at what's required for learning a complex system. The first thing is we would need like a set of tools to represent the mental models of various problems that we deal with. One example of a problem could be there is a lot of attrition in my team because my manager left, let's say. So manager leaving is a trigger for some of his direct reports leaving, and then that causes a vicious cycle. And to represent such a problem, for example, we need tools. Another example being the inflation numbers are very high, and the government wants to do something to curb inflation. And so the government tries to do something around interest rate policies. So interest rate causes some changes to inflation, causes some changes to consumer behavior. All of these things require some way to model these systems. Once we can understand and have the tools to model these systems, we need to be able to test our hypothesis of how these systems behave and interact. And those are simulation models that we need to have access to. First, we need to understand the mental models of the various problems. Then we need tools to simulate those mental models. And we need scientific ways in which we can experiment and make decisions to make changes in this system. So those are the three big pillars of how we can go about learning in a complex system. And in this process, we will see a lot of resistance. Any new change, any new decision in any policy will have change resistance. And it arises because of various reasons. The one big reason is the people who are implementing change don't really understand the entire system. They don't understand the delayed feedback mechanisms. Our actions also alter the system. And so, as decision makers, as leaders, when we make those decisions, there are people working counteractive to our decisions to stabilize the system just in case we made a mistake. So, there are counteractive forces at play. There are things that we don't understand that are at play. And if we think of a complex system as a mere cause and effect, then that causes a lot of problems. So if we think of everything as event oriented, this caused this, A caused B, so I'm going to fix A, so B will be fixed. That's a very myopic way of looking at the system. So there's going to be a lot of resistance when you look at certain things very narrowly. So our thinking needs to expand in a pretty big way. There is a lot of interdependencies between various systems that play in a big policy, in a small policy, in a team setting. For some examples, there was a time when in Romania there was quite a bit of low birth rate. So the government insisted on some policies to counteract this low birth rate because the population was dwindling at that rate. So what they did was they removed legal abortion. They incentivized higher family tax structures and a whole host of things. And so instantaneously the rate went up, birth rate went up, but what we saw over time is that it actually came down very quickly in 4 years back to the same level and started regressing even further. So even those policy changes didn't have any impact. Similarly, in our team, when we make some changes in terms of issues that happen, the bugs that show up in the products that we build, if we don't have policies in place to actually fix those issues, then all what we will do is constantly firefight, constantly be fixing issues and never be iterating on newer product and features. US inflation and interest rate, global climate change, this whole host of people with various policies that are being resisted at various different levels. There's disagreement between various people. So unless everyone learns these tools to model these systems, then there's going to be this policy resistance for various reasons that we've highlighted. And the other big thing is feedback. Feedback is another reason in real world which is usually delayed. And so when you implement a policy in Romania, and they implemented, the feedback of actually those policy not working took 4 years. And basically feedback is something that changes the system. So when we make a new policy, it takes time for it to implement, and there is a delayed feedback in the real world. So knowing as a leader that there is going to be some sort of feedbacks, counteractive feedbacks, or feedbacks because of the changes you've done. There are two different types of feedback loops. Positive feedback loop, which is self-reinforcing. For example, if there is a lot of adoption of Microsoft Windows, Then there'll be a lot of developers on Microsoft Windows. A lot of developers causes more apps on Microsoft Windows, and so Microsoft Windows goes up and up back in the 90s. Similar, so that's a positive reinforcing loop. Similarly, there's a negative balancing loop. For example, if if you're a farmer and you also have few chickens in your farmland in one area, and the chicken they grow on their own, um, and that is the positive feedback loop of growth cycle for them. But some of them will cross the road. When they cross the road, they get killed. So then that's a negative balancing loop. Some get killed, some die over time because of age. So there are two types of loops in any business systems: a positive loop which reinforces, and a negative loop that balances out. And side effects are also some sort of feedback. The more feedback we get, the more side effects that we get is directly proportional to our understanding of the system. So if we implement a policy and that policy fails miserably and a lot of side effects, that means we really didn't understand the system as much. What we need to realize is that when we implement those policies, feedbacks take time. It takes time for it to show up. And if we don't understand the system, then there'll be feedback will show up as side effects. And so the only way out is to expand our mental models, our limited understanding of the system, to incorporate feedback, to incorporate time delays. So all the systems today, business systems, technology systems, government systems, every system consists of some sort of a positive loop or a negative loop. And they're all connected. They interact with each other. And when we try to model our systems, we usually use some sort of intuition. And when the intuition for decision making fails, we go to the simulation. But we have to realize in this is that there is some sort of feedback, and there is some sort of intuition, which comes to this topic of mental model. To understand mental model, let's look at this sentence. The eye sees only what the mind is prepared to comprehend. The eye sees only what the mind is prepared to comprehend. It's a very deep sentence. So, mental models are basically our own internal rules that we have set in our minds, our quick understanding of the external reality. And whatever that is inside our mind is what we see. So basically, mental models are a collection of routines or standard operating procedures, things that we just do automatically, habits, scripts that we use for possibly selecting actions. When certain things happen in the outside world, we behave in a certain way. So those are our habits. Cognitive maps of a domain. So if you understand how to write software engineering, then we have certain domain knowledge understanding. That's part of our mental model. When we read alphabets, there's typographies and there's topologies for certain experience and categories of experiences. There's logical structures for interpretation of language. When I say something and you're listening to me right now, how do you understand it? There's a mental model. Or attribution about individuals we encounter in our daily life. So we behave culturally in different ways. Culture, part of mental model. It's how we perceive the world. So mental models are also used to infer motives, construct meaning. When I say something, something comes into your mind. It's also mental model. Interpret language and interpret actions. All the decisions are based on mental models. Most of us do not appreciate the ubiquity and invisibility of the mental models. Instead, believing naively that whatever our senses reveal is the real world. So today we know for a fact that the eye projects on a planar surface, but the mind creates this 3D object with various images and all of that, right? Similarly, the eye today projects that the earth is flat, but we know because we put a satellite in space and we know for sure it's not round, right? It's not flat. So similarly, our mental model, when our mental model expands, our mental abilities expand, our view of the world expands. Our view of the world expands, we get a better understanding of the system, its lack of biases. So it's very important to understand mental models. But now, to increase our boundaries of mental models, like what are the barriers to learning? If we can learn everything quickly, then we'll be better off. So the barriers to learning is that in the real world, learning is slow. For example, it took 264 years after the fix of scurvy disease was found to eat lemon for those sailors. It took them 264 years to learn and iterate that this is the real fix for this issue. With the rate of change that we are experiencing right now, with climatic conditions, with technology adoptions, and everything outside of the world, with population increasing, our rate of learning needs to expand much faster. And if we depend on purely learning from real world experiences, then certain times those situations may be one way, meaning after a certain point, the climate just is not fixable. And the other piece is that everything outside, be it working in a team, working in various teams, working in a company, working in at home, and in some institution or with the government, it's a complex system. It's a dynamic system. It constantly changes. There's delayed feedback. Certain times there's no feedback. Certain times ambiguous feedback from people. And it's non-linear. Certain times certain things cause certain things. Other times everything is completely different. So it's not like predictable. It's history dependent, it changes, it's adapting, it's self-organizing, and there are resistances in place. People are very different, every person every day is very different. Our understanding, our reasoning, our mental models of every person is different. Cultural organization, upbringing, everything is different. It's a very dynamic system. And even if we comprehend the dynamism of it, we realize very quickly that we use certain tools to measure it, and those tools are also biased, and the fact that we are measuring certain thing itself is distorting some reality by some approximating of what that actually is. And so many times we also ignore what the reality is, and a lot of times there is competing theories. We think A causes B, but there could be A plus B plus C plus D that cause D or C. So there are confounding variables, there are competing theories, mix-ups of various theories happen all the time. And the big piece we discussed earlier is the mental model, is boundaries to our rationality. Only certain number of things we can do in our head. Our attention is limited, our memory recall is limited, information processing and capability is limited, and the time that we have for decision making is also very limited. In all of this, and if we have cognitive maps that are failed, meaning we don't have a clear representation of reality, and if we have our own perceived representation of reality, and people make poor judging decisions, they make poor judgments. And a lot of time people also have flaws when it comes to attribution. They tend to blame the person rather than the situation in which that person is that actually causes the problem. And there's a lot of biases at play, a lot of judgments. There's no clear feedback, and absolutely opposite feedback than what the reality is. And there is a lot of defensive routines, personally for me, personally for everyone, which is we're not open to being challenged for certain cultural upbringing or cultural mental models. A lot of times we're very defensive. When we are defensive, we are uninformed, we are ambiguous, we're using ambiguous data to make decisions, and if they don't change, that's a problem. And there's always this constant need to maintain our current performance while we are learning, even though when we know that if we spend a little bit more time to learn and to actually make a better hypothesis and iterate and experiment, that it'll be better for us long term. But we still do not take that risk of educated risk of reducing our performance a little bit to gain better performance in the year or two. So our learning capability is greatly diminished. And even if, let's say, all of this was taken care of, when we try to implement the right policy at the right time, there could be implementation failures. There could be local incentives for people to not do certain things certain way. It could be cheaper for them. It could be more quicker for them, or whatever reason. There could be asymmetric information. What you know as policymaker may be completely different than what they know as policymaking. policy impacting them. And there could be private agenda. Everyone has their own private set of agenda. So this is a bunch of reasons why learning could be slow. Learning and implementing those decision making could be slow. So now, what can we do? Well, that's where computerized simulation models at least help us in a very quick way to simulate things from the outside world. If we get a better understanding and a rational understanding, we can go and simulate things quickly as much as possible. It's not going to solve everything, but it's actually a big boon to be able to simulate various things on the outside world in a computerized system, because it can be done very quickly. You could do years of simulation in maybe seconds. You could do certain things that are unethical, like say if you want to experiment on someone, but that's unethical to be doing in real life, but you can do it with data on a computer. You do it on a computer, it's using data, and that data, which is ethical data, you could run experiments, and you could do it hundreds of times. You can't do big high stakes experiments in the real world on real people and have real impact on them hundreds of times, not even once maybe. So certain times even your decisions you can halt in a computerized system. You can say, hey, I want to pause this big decision, I want to analyze, and I'm going to change this variable, I'm going to tweak a little bit. But you can't do that on a real system. When you're given an order worth hundreds of thousands of dollars, you've bought a house for a various reason, then you can't say, hey, this house is actually a bad investment. Well, you have to simulate all of those things earlier, and then you have a better chance. So you can pause a decision, you could reverse an action, you could get simulate quick results, you could do things that are high stakes, and you could still have a very low cost way of doing it. And realize that in our mind, until it's developed in a big way, there are serious limitations on how much it can simulate various models and various things. And that's where intuition comes in. How do we develop our intuition? But until that's there, we could use the computer systems to guide us as to what can happen. It can help us inform our mental models. It can help us improve our mental models. It can give us scientific reasonings that are actually grounded in data. And it could also influence other people. Like if every country can simulate the impact on carbon dioxide on their environment, and then the cost benefit of actually removing or introducing carbon tax credit, then everyone will do it in the best way. So it can also influence the group to behave in a really good way. So using computerized simulation model is a blessing, and you can iterate, right, on various ways. The thing that's needed for this is you need a safe learning environment where there's a trusted setup. People feel safe to learn, and it's fun. Then if we do that, then there is a good computerized models that we can set up and build, which we learn in the later parts of this book. But the thing to be cautious about is every human being is different. The book doesn't, the author clearly says, John Sterman, he clearly says that we cannot simulate everything in life. It's just not possible. But what we can, let's do a good job at simulating, right? So he's saying every human being is different, human mind, human behavior, everything's different. But there are many parts that can be simulated. And for that, if we can use the computer systems to learn quickly and not make terribly bad mistakes and waste efforts, time, energy, and money, then why not use the computer where it makes sense? So use it, but do not use the computer simulation to prove your point. Use it to learn. If you already have a hypothesis that you want to prove it and you run a simulation based on that, and then you have a biased model, then the model is broken. So do not do that. So that's the only caution. And finally, there are a lot of challenges in the outside world. All of those challenges can be seen as big opportunities. And it has never been this many opportunities before in the entire history of the mankind. So learning for us is critical. Representing the complex system that we deal with in our current teams, in our current businesses, in our current settings, in terms of decision making, is very important. So if we can learn quickly with the help of computerized simulation models, and if we have a scientific reasoning for that learning, then our decisions will be strong, our decisions will be long-term good, and these techniques in this book will help us as a catalyst towards sustainable future. So understanding complex business systems, and the techniques for doing it, the tools, are very much essential for the success of all of us. So I'll see you in the next video. Thanks.